Hey everybody, welcome to the Flexible Dieting Podcast. I'm Joe Klemczewski with Kevin Brunacini, Austin Kiergaard. Today we're going to talk about calories. Wanted to break down something that seems pretty general, pretty obvious, but I think there is enough nuance here that you could walk away with some good practical information. First of all, probably Austin, for you being a dietitian, what are calories? Why do we use that as a unit of measurement?
So it's measuring a unit of heat, how much energy it takes to require to increase something by a degree. We use that to measure energy, excuse me, because our body requires energy, right? Energy is all around us. We burn energy. We need energy to help burn and help to drive those things. So that's a very simple way of explaining it, I guess. I have more to add to that, but it'll be relevant, I think, later in this discussion. So that's kind of my answer with energy.
Perfect, because I would not want to get too technical. Yeah, just knowing that it's a unit of heat transfer, that it's, this is how we measure energy, just like you could measure mileage, kilometers, meters, inches, those kind of things. It's just a different way of measuring that in our body. I would be interested because I know there are different thoughts on this, maybe different ways it has been investigated. But there is so much speculation and maybe misinformation about how many calories we truly need. You see the US RDA or other government entities, when you look at nutrition fact panels, base everything on a 2,000 calorie a day average. So the average adult human being needs 2,000 calories a day. Looking at a broad spectrum, male to female, 18 years old to 100 years old, how does that differ in genetically the uniqueness, back to you, Austin, in just, what do you think a good bullseye would be if any average person is saying, hey, this is how many calories I probably need? What's a good academic place to at least start, even though we know you're going to be somewhere else on that continuum?
Yeah. So the reason that 2,000 calories exists is because that's kind of the assumption, right? So everybody could start out at 2,000 calories. What we know is things change, right? Genetics play a role, activity plays a role. So if people are at a starting point, they can start at that 2,000 calorie marker, but it brings back then some social things like what's the goal? Is that a realistic amount for you to hit given your goal and your lifestyle? So if someone's looking for a spot to start, they can certainly start there. The interesting thing of those 2,000 calories, and we can kind of get into this here in a little bit, is if you're grocery shopping and you look at like a food label, it says 2,000 calories, right? You'll also notice that there's those daily percent values. And I think those can get confusing for people trying to read labels, because what that means is this is how much daily percent value of these calories and of this nutrient that you need. So I try to encourage people to pay a little less attention to those percent daily values because they are very confusing for people, and paying attention more to the calories and the RDAs on more of your micronutrients. And on those nutrition fact labels, they do have those as well. Again, I can get into that, or we can get into that later, but I just wanted to kind of make note of that. So to answer your question, you can start with 2,000 calories, document everything you do. Is it feeling good? Is it not? Are you seeing results? Are you not? Because it can be much deeper than that, but that would be a good starting point.
I promise I'll bring you in here in a minute, Kevin, but to continue on with this topic. Way back, I think in the 1920s, maybe even a little bit earlier, when they were starting to look at how to chemically measure this, and things like the Harris-Benedict equation were fashioned, and all kinds of modifications from then. I think what has really stood the test of time, but this is my question to you, has it really? Are there better ways to make these assumptions? When you talk about basal metabolic rate, so taking activity out of the equation, just kind of the average sedentary, non-exercised person, around 1,650 calories for a male, 1,350 calories for a female. Those were some of the earliest versions. And I would argue that we were way more active back then, but just without that exercise-induced metabolic need. Does that hold up to you? Because then, of course, for somebody trying to calculate this, let's say an average male 1,650 calories, and then I would have to add in the amount of calories for intentional movement and exercise. So maybe I do get up toward 2,000. And then if I want to be in a calorie deficit, I would have to subtract that. But are there any other formulas or just textbook assumptions that are taught now about what the average true metabolism is for the two different sexes?
That's a good question. So while I'm chatting with you, the answer is yes, there's a different approach. And I was just doing some quick math. So there are a lot of equations, Harris-Benedict, the Mifflin equation. And there's also, like, in our world, what we see is there's different calorie ranges for different populations and different age groups and different weights. And what I mean by that is none of that plays a factor in activity. So let's say, Joe, let's say you weigh 85 kilograms and we have you eat 25 calories per kilogram. That's 2,100 calories. So to answer your question, then no, it's probably even higher, because I didn't even factor in activity. That does not assume activity at all. That's just, we look at calorie ranges. Like in our clinical setting, 25 to 30 calories per kilogram with a person that's got a normal BMI is kind of a calorie range that we require. And again, I have not even discussed if that person is active. Now, that is in a clinical setting, but it's also fairly relative to non-clinical setting for sedentary everyday people, 25 to 30 calories per kilo. So it's going to depend on your weight, and that has nothing to do with your activity level. So if you're a bigger person, right, it's going to be a bigger calorie amount. If you're a smaller person, that's going to be a lower calorie amount. So if someone's just waking up, getting out of bed, how can I eat healthier? They could use that type of calorie range. I certainly don't expect anyone to go and learn Mifflin and Harrisburg equations and do it that way, because then the interesting thing about those equations, those also don't technically take in an activity factor. So if you are increasing activity, now you have to take whatever you calculate by that activity factor. And even in a clinical setting, we would call that an injury factor, right? You might be having an amputation. I know I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I'm trying to beat home that there are so many ways to calculate calories for so many different people that it's just really hard to just say this is the gold standard. Certainly there are equations if I'm calculating things for my clients that I use, but it's because I know that background information that I talk about in practically every episode that we've been in. So yeah, that's kind of my answer with are there other ways of calculating? There are, and there are other ways of calculating when it's not including activity.
In the application part of that science, because I just had 2 new clients start yesterday, and that's the first step. They fill out an intake form. I'm learning all this demographic information, their age, their sex, how they have perhaps integrated nutrition in the past, what they've been successful with. I'm looking for all of these clues, because I may have that assumption of an average calorie need for that person, but I've got to find out on that continuum 0 to 100 where they may stand. And so as a qualifier, a good coach would always say, well, hey, this is why I'm saying this is a good target for us, but I could be under or overestimating because I just don't know your genetics. It could go in all kinds of different directions. So Kevin, one of the questions I get from clients often, because we tend to very quickly break that down into macronutrients, so we're giving them some ranges and more specificity for their goals. Protein, carbs, fat, we all have needs for those in different ways. There are quantitative and qualitative aspects to that. So first, two-part question. We all, I think, probably have to start with calories. I don't just start pulling numbers out of the air like, well, you look like you need this much protein, I think I'll give you this much fat. It's, calorie need, energy balance first, and then we start breaking those down in different ways. But when a client asks you, hey, shouldn't I count calories? Do I track calories? How do you explain the difference between macronutrients and calories to them?
I will say I really appreciate Austin breaking that down regarding calories. That was actually really interesting to learn that. And I conducted calculated my calories just off the 25 to 30, and it's a little bit higher than what my usual calorie load would usually be. But just find that interesting. Just it's far more complicated and nuanced it's not surprising to us, but it is far more complicated and nuanced than you would imagine. But to answer the question, Joe, I tell them that macronutrients make up the calories. So calories ultimately is what's defaulted to. So you obviously got calories. That is your energy balance. That's what by what you're consuming. That's what's giving you energy. However, how those calories break down, they can go into macronutrients, which are going to be protein, carbs, or fats. Of course, those macronutrients can break down further into micronutrients and give you trace elements, minerals, etc., electrolytes. Those further break down to give the body rather bioavailable nutrients to absorb, use, storage, etc. But there can be, for those that are new to macronutrient-based counting or just logging, or using as a methodology for dieting and eating, it is confusing to them because they think it as two separate things, although you can track them separately. If you're ultimately tracking calories, you're always ahead of the game, because that's ultimately what's going to come down to. That's from the pyramid. If we look at the hierarchy, that is the foundational tier that we all need to respect. But if we want to up it, if you will, having prioritization of protein, for example, would be the next step, just because there is going to be some effectiveness and satiety benefits there. It's just kind of upping the game in the sense of making your meals more satiating, or going to help you with comes to exercise benefits, etc. So that's where it gets a little bit more nuanced. For Gen Pop, it eventually is going to be applicable and relevant to them, but most of the time we're just sticking with calories. And then at least when we have a baseline calculated off some averages, that's how I like to do it, at least, then we're going to inevitably go into macronutrients, separate those out based on context, preference, etc., and calculate those a little bit further for them and continue to fine tune as they go.
Yeah, I often think that's a step some coaches miss, and it's to the disadvantage of the client. Like when I wrote my first book and was just initially starting to see clients in a formal setting 25, 28 years ago, I had my building blocks of nutrition, and the foundational level was calorie intake, energy balance. And then, as you said, it got into breaking down the macronutrients, protein, carbs, fat. Then up another tier was meal spacing, meal timing, and you keep going down, as you said, all the way to the top into micronutrition. But if you just, when I see clients sometimes coming from other coaches and they just say, and they talk about quote numbers, what numbers do you want me to hit? What are my numbers? And they always default to protein, carbs, and fat, the macros. I like to go back to the calorie base just to get them used to that. This is what we're targeting, because when they leave me at some point, or they're on their own, they're fully independent, I still want them to see that that's what matters most. Because when it comes to deviating, and this is something I'm getting into a little bit more for my advanced clients, I will give them some discretion. Instead of saying, okay, we're targeting 150 grams of carbs, 130 grams of protein, etc., I will say, here's the calorie target we're looking at. If your protein is within these ranges, and giving them a 10 to 20 gram buffer, if your carbs are within these ranges, if your fat is within these ranges, then what we really want every day is to get close to this target calorie range. But I want you to see that you can have some deviation for flexibility and some nuance throughout your day. And that points them back to the fact that energy balance is really still home base. And these macronutrients are there for a reason, but there's nothing magic about hitting it to the gram or within 5 grams. So Austin, are you doing that at all, or do you tell clients like, hey, let's have this buffer zone where you're giving them some discretion?
Yeah, I tell them that because I've worked with some pretty intense type A personalities where they're like, it's the granule of rice on the docket, and it's like, hey, if you can hit that, great. It's not going to make or break you if you're off 5 or 10. If you're off 20, 30 every day, then we might see some slight differences. I also bring home, and I know we've talked about this before, I bring home the weekly calories. Like, hey, here's your proteins, carbs, fats, here's your calories, here's what that would look like in a weekly calorie range. So if you're even off one day, like something just went wrong and you corrected it the next day, and those weekly calories are still within the ranges, you're still going to be okay for the most part. And if not, if something went wrong, well, we just know that there was an outlier there, because it's really easy for people to just get obsessed with the calories and the math. And so that's why I like giving them that buffer. Like, hey, if you're within 5 to 10 or 10 to 20 or whatever, like you're going to be okay. Like, you know what I mean? Like there is some flexibility here, you know what I mean? So, and it allows them also to be a little bit easier on themselves, so they don't feel like they're a failure if they were off by a little bit, because really they're not, you know what I mean? So I like to be open and honest with that conversation. So that way they feel better prepared, the expectations are better placed, and they're more accepting of starting that journey.
Perfect. And as a way of wrapping us up, Kevin, to that point, when somebody is going over calorie wise, like to what Austin just said, if they're over 20 or 30 grams of carbs, but yet they were down 10 or 15 grams of fat, so calorically it still kind of was okay, it was an okay day, there may or may not be any deviation in progress. But if somebody's higher by 300 or 400 calories, they kind of inadvertently hit a maintenance day. Do you see, and maybe how do you explain to them that biology is very threshold based? It's not always just that we hit this average and it did kind of come out with the wash, as Austin said. But if we have a couple days that are too high, we could be refilling glycogen stores, and all of a sudden, like, we really did have a maintenance week. You dieted perfectly well 80% of the week, but you didn't get 80% of the results. You got 0, because of that metabolic switch, and it takes 3 or 4 days to get back to that continuum. So how often do you really see that and have to address it as a practitioner?
It's probably the most common thing I see week to week is just clients, they don't have the greatest week, or something just comes up and they just hit a maintenance, which in the grand scheme, it's better than doing the opposite and just completely regressing and binging or overeating entirely and just going in the other direction. So I like to start there in a sense of a compassionate tone of it's okay, because truly it is. I understand. Again, I'm Gen Pop, not to say it's end of the world or going to be end of the world, but I'm not dealing with advanced athletes to where, that it's, we need that extra percentage of grit and intensity to get to that mark. But nevertheless, it's still important. But truly in this sense, it's okay. A week, big deal. You have 51 other weeks to make up for it. We'll be okay if you want to see it like that. But if it's a pattern of consistent and they're just spinning their wheels, then okay, then it's going to be a more in-depth conversation, probably more behavioral in the sense of what's going on to allow this to occur, because one time is a mistake, second time is more or less a choice. Again, that's really overstating it, generally speaking, but what's going on, let's talk about that. And that's a whole other, there's the next topic then, Austin, but it's a big topic at that point.
The third time you're just an asshole, that's the Kevin Brunacini.
It's 2 times. Second time you're an asshole. Don't push my buttons.
All right, guys. Well, thank you guys very much. Perfect conversation on this. I did want to talk about something that really did. This could be something we almost skip over, which is very foundational and important. So thank you guys, and we'll see you next time in the Flexible Dieting Podcast.